Imagine you're just standing by the office microwave. It's a Tuesday. You're waiting for your oatmeal to heat up, scrolling on your phone, minding your own business.
Right. A totally normal morning.
Exactly. And then a coworker walks in, leans against the counter, and just casually drops a comment about like a highly controversial new tax law or some polarizing political headline from that morning.
Oh, wow. Yeah. The worst.
Instantly, the oxygen just leaves the room, your heart rate spikes, you get that slight tunnel vision, and you have exactly, 3 seconds to respond before this turns into either a career-ending argument or this deeply, deeply uncomfortable silence. What do you actually say?
Well, it's the ultimate conversational nightmare, isn't it? The tension spikes and your physiological fight or flight response kicks in.
Yeah, your body's literally pumping cortisol.
Exactly. Cortisol, adrenaline, your brain is screaming for a way out. And the standard vocabulary we rely on every single day just completely evaporates.
Which brings us perfectly to our mission for you today. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating set of sources that break down the mechanics of advanced English conversation.
Right. Specifically, what linguists call C1 level communication strategies.
Yes, C1 level. We're going to look at exactly how you navigate these incredibly tense, high-stakes discussions without letting them blow up in your face.
And, without sacrificing your own opinions in the process, which is key.
Totally key. Okay, let's unpack this, because the underlying premise here is really counterintuitive. When we find ourselves in those suffocating moments by the microwave, our instinct is usually to either win the argument by, crushing the other person with facts, or to just flee the room as fast as humanly possible.
Right, the classic fight or flight. But what's fascinating here is that the source material makes a really compelling argument that true communicative mastery isn't about winning at all.
Not even slightly.
Not even slightly. I mean, if your goal is to win, you've already lost the broader objective.
Wow, okay. How so?
Because true mastery is about staying in the conversation. It's about gracefully managing the friction and, honestly, above all else, preserving the underlying relationship.
You want to be able to look this person in the eye the next day.
Precisely. You don't want to carry a mountain of lingering resentment into the office on Wednesday.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And the sources we're using today, they don't just offer abstract theory, right? They ground everything in reality.
Yes, they do. We'll be analyzing transcripts of 2 very relatable everyday case studies.
Right. The first involves navigating the modern, heavily polarized political minefield in a workplace.
And then the second shifts gears to a much quieter but, equally pervasive tension. The controversial rise of the subscription economy.
Ugh, don't even get me started on that. The growing frustration over the fact that we no longer seem to own the things we use.
Right, we'll get deep into that one later.
So dealing with all of this requires a completely different toolkit than what most of us are taught in standard communication classes. So let's look at the mechanics of tact, and specifically how we have to completely redesign our default reactions.
Because the source highlights a really glaring issue with how human beings operate when we feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. When the temperature goes up, we default to incredibly blunt, defensive phrases. Things like, I don't know, or just straight up, let's stop talking about this.
Which, is completely understandable from a biological standpoint.
How so? What's happening in the brain?
Well, when we feel socially or intellectually threatened, the prefrontal cortex, that's the logical nuance part of our brain, it basically starts handing over control to the amygdala.
A threat response center.
Exactly. Our brains seek the fastest, most direct route to safety. But linguistically, leaning on those defaults is just catastrophic.
Let's drill down into why that is. On the surface, it seems, pretty harmless. If I ask you a complex question about international trade policy and you say, I don't know, you're just admitting a lack of information.
Right. It's honest.
Yeah.
In a neutral setting, sure. If I ask you what time the train arrives and you say, I don't know, it's just a statement of fact.
But in an argument.
In the context of a heated discussion, I don't know, rarely means you literally lack data. Functionally, it acts as a conversational shield.
A shield, right?
And to the other person, it comes across as highly dismissive. It implies you haven't bothered to consider their perspective. Or worse, that their perspective isn't worth your cognitive effort to process.
Ouch. Yeah, that would make me mad.
Exactly. It shuts down the exchange, but it leaves this thick residue of frustration.
It's like hanging up the phone mid-sentence. You ended the call, sure, but the other person is just sitting there staring at the receiver, getting angrier by the second.
That is a perfect analogy.
And the other default, saying, let's stop talking about this, that feels even more aggressive.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the verbal equivalent of slamming a heavy wooden door directly in someone's face.
Jeez.
It doesn't just stop the conversation, it creates an immediate adversarial boundary. You are asserting authority over the interaction.
Like a parent to a child, almost.
Exactly. You're telling the other person that their desire to speak is officially overruled by your desire to stop. It's a power play, even if you're doing it out of panic.
And nobody likes being thrown through the windshield because someone else panicked and yanked the verbal emergency brake.
Right. Nobody.
So the source provides us with what I like to call linguistic upgrades. These are advanced phrases designed to handle that exact same discomfort, but, with elegance.
Right.
Let's walk through them because they're incredibly practical.
Let's do it.
The first one the source offers as a replacement for I don't know is this. I wouldn't want to jump to conclusions without knowing all the facts.
Look at the structural brilliance of that sentence. It achieves the exact same functional goal as I don't know.
Which is getting you out of committing to a firm stance in a tense moment.
Right. But instead of sounding dismissive, it frames your retreat as a virtue. It makes you sound thoughtful, measured, and objective.
It's like you're putting on a pair of reading glasses and staring thoughtfully into the distance. You're communicating, I respect the gravity of this topic so much that I refuse to treat it lightly.
Yes. It buys you vital processing time. And it completely diffuses any pressure the other person's applying to force you into a corner.
Because if they keep pushing you after you say that, they look unreasonable.
Exactly. You've taken the high ground while simultaneously escaping the trap.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
Now, what about the door slam? What's the upgrade for let's stop talking about this when you genuinely just need the conversation to end before someone says something they regret?
The source suggests an absolute classic. Let's just agree to disagree on this one.
A classic for a reason.
Definitely. This is what linguists refer to as a soft exit strategy. It's heavily reliant on face saving.
Face saving, like preserving dignity.
Right. When a conversation is spiraling or just looping endlessly without any hope of resolution, you need a way out where no one loses face. Let's agree to disagree is a mutual concession.
It acknowledges the validity of the fundamental difference in opinion without forcing a winner or a loser.
Exactly.
But wait, does it always work? I mean, if someone is really fired up, won't they just say, no, I don't agree to disagree, you're just wrong?
Well, they might. But by offering the phrase, you've signaled that the debate phase is over. You've offered a handshake to end the match.
Ah, I see.
If they swat your hand away, the social transgression is on them. But usually it works because it preserves the dignity of both parties. It says, we are both intelligent people who have arrived at different conclusions, and that's acceptable.
Okay, so if you want to soften that exit even further, the source offers another phrase that injects a completely different dynamic. We might just have to leave it there before we open a can of worms.
I love this one. Introducing the can of worms idiom is highly effective because it brings a crucial element into a tense situation. Self-aware humor.
Humor goes a long way. For anyone listening who might not use that specific idiom daily, how would you break down a can of worms in this context?
Think of it as a visceral metaphor for exponential complication.
Okay.
If you pry the lid off a literal can of live worms, they don't just sit there neatly. They spill out, they tangle together, they're slippery.
And they are nearly impossible to put back inside the container.
Exactly. In a conversational sense, opening a can of worms means touching upon a subtopic that is so complicated, so historically contentious, and so messy that it will completely derail whatever original point you were trying to make.
It's like finding a loose thread on a sweater. You pull it, thinking you're just fixing a tiny detail, and suddenly half the sleeve unravels.
Yes. By saying, before we open a can of worms, you're playfully acknowledging that both of you are smart enough to see the massive trap ahead, and you're mutually choosing to step around it.
It shifts the dynamic from me versus you to us versus the messy topic.
That shared acknowledgement is key. You're building a tiny bridge of agreement over the fact that the topic is a mess.
Now, moving on to actual disagreement. If someone states an opinion that you fundamentally oppose, the raw instinct is to say, I completely disagree with you, or you're wrong.
Right. Fighting words.
Yeah. But the source gives us a much softer alternative. I wouldn't quite go that far.
The heavy lifting in that phrase is being done by the word quite as degree modifier.
A degree modifier, okay.
When you say, I disagree, you are positioning yourself as an absolute opponent. You're standing on the opposite side of a massive canyon.
Right.
But when you say, I wouldn't quite go that far, You are implicitly suggesting that you're on the exact same spectrum of thought, you just haven't traveled as far down the road as they have.
Oh, that's clever. It completely calibrates the conflict. It softens a direct confrontational disagreement into a mere difference of measurement.
It's a phenomenal de-escalator. You aren't challenging their entire worldview, you're just haggling over the extremity of their conclusion.
And then there's the final tool in this foundational toolkit. When someone says something highly opinionated, instead of agreeing or disagreeing, you just offer a calm observation. That is one way of looking at it.
Yes.
The source refers to this as brilliant neutrality, acknowledging the perspective without endorsing it or rejecting it. But, I have to push back on this one.
Let's hear it.
Isn't saying that is one way of looking at it. Just a polite, highly passive-aggressive way of saying you're crazy.
Oh.
If someone tells me the moon landing was faked on a soundstage, and I smile tightly and say, well, that is one way of looking at it, I'm definitely not validating their perspective. I'm judging them heavily.
That's a really sharp observation, and it highlights why C1 communication is about way more than just reading lines from a script. It all comes down to delivery, tone, and context.
Tone is everything.
Right. If you deliver that phrase with a smirk, a heavy sigh, or an eye roll, absolutely. It becomes a thinly veiled insult. It's dripping with condescension. But when delivered with genuine calm neutrality, it serves a very specific protective function.
Protective how? Like protecting myself?
Exactly. You are verbally holding the other person's opinion at arm's length. You're saying, I see the shape of your argument. I acknowledge it exists in the world.
Without actually touching it.
Right. You are validating their right to hold the view without merging your reality with theirs. You aren't giving them the friction they're looking for.
Okay. I like that image of holding it at arm's length. It's almost like verbal martial arts. Think about aikido.
Oh, I love this analogy. Go on.
So in traditional blocking, like in karate, you put up a rigid shield to stop a punch. You absorb all that kinetic energy, which hurts, and you create a massive collision.
A force meeting force.
Exactly. But in aikido, you use the opponent's momentum. When they lunge, you grab their wrist, you step out of the way, and you let their own energy carry them safely past you. That is one way of looking at it, is a verbal aikido move. You're letting their intense, aggressive opinion safely roll right past you without letting it hit your core. You refuse to provide the wall for them to crash into.
That captures the mechanics perfectly. You're redirecting the conversational momentum rather than meeting force with force.
Mm-hmm.
And that distinction between absorbing an attack and redirecting it is exactly what separates intermediate communication from advanced mastery.
Okay, so we've got the theory down. We have our tool belt full of these aikido phrases, these soft exits, and these degree modifiers. But how do they actually hold up out in the wild?
That's the real test.
It's one thing to practice these in a vacuum. It's another to deploy them when the temperature is rising and the coffee is spilling. Now we're stepping into a dialogue that brings up infrastructure, national debt, media bias, and even the word socialism.
A literal minefield.
Exactly. And just to be absolutely clear up front to you, our listener, as we look at this, we aren't taking sides or endorsing either political camp. We are strictly looking at the architecture of how these two argue, not what they are arguing about.
Yes. Our interest is entirely in the structural engineering of the conversation.
Yeah.
We're studying the design of the bridge, not evaluating the politicians driving over it.
Beautifully said. So, into the break room we go. The source presents a highly realistic dialogue between two coworkers, Tyler and Derek.
It's a Tuesday morning.
Yep. Tyler comes in incredibly frustrated because a massive $3 trillion infrastructure bill was just shot down by the government for the third time in 2 years. Tyler's argument is rooted in tangible, physical reality.
The things he can see.
Exactly. He's looking out the window, pointing out that the roads are literally falling apart, bridges are decades past their safety inspection dates, and he argues that at some point, a government simply must spend money to maintain the physical country.
It's an argument of immediate necessity.
Right. And then we have Derek's counter perspective. Derek doesn't disagree that the roads need fixing. He has to drive over the same potholes Tyler does.
Right. Nobody likes potholes.
Nobody.
Oh.
But Derek's focus is entirely on the fiscal mechanism. He argues that you cannot just throw $3 trillion at a problem without a concrete mathematical plan to pay for it.
His underlying fear is generational.
Generational, exactly. He does not want his kids inheriting a massive, unsustainable national debt and a fractured economy just because the current generation couldn't figure out how to budget properly.
It's a classic, agonizing clash of priorities. Immediate physical necessity versus long-term economic stability.
And if we look closely at the in-depth analysis of this disconnect in the source, it highlights a crucial, almost terrifying point about modern communication.
Yes, the media aspect.
Tyler is genuinely bewildered. He can't understand why nobody can agree on fixing a pothole. But Derek points out the reality of media fragmentation,
Which is huge.
He notes that people are watching the exact same piece of legislation unfold on different television channels. One channel is telling its viewers this bill will save America and rebuild our glory.
And the other channel.
The other channel is telling its viewers this bill is a Trojan horse for socialism and economic ruin.
This gets to the root of why these conversations feel impossible. Derek is pointing out that half the country is working off a completely different baseline of information than the other half.
A different reality, essentially.
Think about two architects trying to build a house together. If my blueprint says we're building a Victorian mansion, and your blueprint says we're building a modern glass cube, we are never going to agree on where to pour the concrete foundation.
Wow, yeah, you can't even start.
The conflict isn't necessarily born of malice, or stupidity, or stubbornness. It's born of fundamentally fragmented realities. We aren't just disagreeing on the solution, we're disagreeing on the basic nature of the problem.
Which perfectly explains why certain topics have become practically impossible to discuss in casual settings. Tyler uses a really powerful metaphor in the dialogue.
The grenades.
The grenades. He says that issues like this, and he specifically mentions immigration as another example, have become conversational grenades. You pull the pin, you drop the topic onto the break room table, and everyone in the room just physically and emotionally braces for impact.
Bracing for impact is such a vivid description. It implies an inevitable, destructive collision. You tighten your muscles, you narrow your eyes, you prepare for the blast wave.
You're just waiting for the explosion.
And the psychological fallout of living in a landscape covered in these conversational grenades is a deep, pervasive exhaustion.
It's exhaustion.
Yeah.
I feel that.
As Derek notes, this constant state of bracing has led to a bleak reality where people have simply lost trust. They no longer trust government institutions to function. They no longer trust the fragmented media to tell the truth. And tragically, they barely trust their own neighbors anymore.
So what's the ultimate defense mechanism against this exhaustion?
They just check out. They disengage entirely from the civic process to protect their own mental peace.
It's incredibly bleak. Tyler literally says that is a pretty bleak way to look at it. And here's where the tension peaks. Right at this moment, the conversation is teetering on the edge of a total doom spiral.
The abyss.
Tyler and Derek are standing over the abyss of modern societal collapse, and they haven't even finished their morning coffee. If neither of them intervenes, they're both going to walk back to their desks depressed, angry, and alienated from each other.
But then Derek executes a massive conversational save.
A masterclass save.
He recognizes the spiral and deploys the exact toolkit we just analyzed. When Tyler calls the situation totally bleak, Derek immediately softens the trajectory. He says, now, I wouldn't quite go that far as to say it's hopeless, but it's not great.
He validates Tyler's feeling, it's not great, but he refuses to let the conversation sink all the way to the bottom of the ocean.
He cuts the anchor rope just in time.
Yes. I wouldn't quite go that far. He uses that degree modifier to create a floor for the despair. He's saying, we can be worried, but we don't have to be hopeless.
And by establishing that floor, he creates a stable platform for Tyler to pivot towards something positive. Because Derek refuses to accept total hopelessness, Tyler is subtly challenged to look for a glimmer of functionality.
Which he actually finds.
Right. Tyler pivots to local politics.
He points out that while the national stage is gridlocked and toxic, local city and state politics are where functioning gears still exist. It's where one person showing up to a city council meeting or voting in a local mayoral race actually moves the needle on daily life.
It's where the potholes actually get filled.
Right.
Yeah.
Regardless of what the national news is screaming about.
And notice Derek's response to this pivot. He uses another tool from our kit. He says, that is one way of looking at it, and I don't disagree.
The aikido move.
Exactly. Yeah. Derek didn't come into the break room looking to champion local politics. That wasn't his original argument. But he recognizes that Tyler has found a safe runway for them to land the plane. So he accepts the premise. He uses that neutral validation to let Tyler's point stand.
Recognizing that they've successfully navigated a massive minefield and actually reached a positive consensus, they know it's time to wrap it up before someone accidentally drops another grenade.
Quit while you're ahead.
Seriously. They end the interaction flawlessly. Derek jokes that they need to get back to work before someone thinks they're starting a podcast, and he deploys the exit strategy. We might just have to leave it there before we open a can of worms.
It's a seamless execution of advanced conversational mechanics. Think about the ground they covered. They touched on massive, polarizing issues: national debt, media bias, systemic distrust, political gridlock.
Heavy stuff for a Tuesday morning.
Very heavy. Yet neither of them raised their voice, neither of them felt personally attacked, and they both walked away with their working relationship completely intact. They preserved the connection.
They diffused the bomb. It's deeply satisfying to watch. But, as we transition out of the break room, the source material takes us in a very different direction. We're moving from the loud, explosive grenades of national politics to a much quieter, sneakier form of tension.
Sneakier is the right word for it.
A tension that isn't causing screaming matches on television, but is subtly, quietly infuriating almost everyone on a monthly basis.
It's a fascinating pivot. The sources transition from the macro-level helplessness of the political sphere to the micro-level helplessness of the modern consumer. We are looking at the death of ownership.
Yes, this shift is incredibly relevant to you, to me, to everyone listening. We're talking about the transition from a society that fundamentally buys things to a society that merely rents access to things.
Renting access, right.
The source provides a laundry list of examples that we interact with every single day. Think about it. Music, movies, video games, news outlets, fitness apps, cloud storage, essential productivity software.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are looking at a massive, systemic architectural shift in how human beings interact with commerce and art.
The hosts in the source material recall this very specific, almost nostalgia feeling of the historical model. Decades ago, if you wanted music, you would go to a physical store.
The record store.
Right. You would exchange $20 for a compact disc. You could read the liner notes, look at the artwork. You took it home, you put it on your physical shelf, and you possessed a quiet certainty that it was yours forever. It was a tangible asset.
The same goes for software.
Oh, man, yeah. If you wanted software, you bought a heavy cardboard box containing Microsoft Word on a CD-ROM. Once it was installed on your hard drive, nobody could take it from you.
Contrast that with the present reality detailed in the source. Now, you don't buy the music. You endure a decade-long subscription to Spotify or Apple Music.
You don't buy the software. You pay a monthly toll to Adobe or Microsoft just to keep the lights on in your creative apps.
Even video games, which used to be cartridges you could trade with your friends on the playground, have morphed into these live service models.
Yes. You log into their servers, you play by their rules, and the terrifying reality is that the moment your credit card expires, or the moment you decide to cancel that subscription, or the moment the company decides to shut down the server, it is as if none of it ever existed.
Your massive library vanishes into the ether. Poof. Gone.
This raises a critical question, one that drives the second case study in our source. Why do we monetize everything in this specific way now?
Because this isn't merely a clever financial shift to ensure predictable recurring revenue for corporate balance sheets. It's a fundamental psychological alteration of the consumer-corporate relationship.
Okay, unpack that.
Under the subscription model, you are no longer purchasing a product. You are licensing a temporary experience. You've moved from being an owner with intrinsic rights to a tenant living under constant threat of eviction.
Okay, hold on. I hear the deep nostalgia in the source material, and I hear the existential dread in your voice about being a digital tenant. But I have to push back on this, because isn't renting objectively better in many ways?
How so?
Think about the sheer scale of access. If I go back to the 90s and I buy that one CD for $20, I own exactly 12 songs. If I take that same $20 today and rent access to a streaming platform, I get the entire history of recorded human audio.
The whole library.
The whole library. I get Mozart, Metallica, and a kid making brilliant beats in his basement in Tokyo, all instantly. Buying one CD is like buying a single brick when you could just rent the whole mansion. Why is the source so focused on the loss of the brick when the mansion is so glorious?
That is a great point. Your brick versus mansion analogy perfectly encapsulates the strongest defense of the subscription model. You're arguing for breadth of access, frictionless convenience, and unlimited discovery.
Right. It's undeniably amazing.
It is. And that tension, the friction between the deep desire to own the brick and the undeniable allure of renting the mansion, is exactly what sets up the conflict in the second dialogue provided in our sources.
Let's dive right into that dialogue. We have two friends, Rachel and Michael. They perfectly embody the two sides of the brick and mansion debate.
Rachel comes into the conversation absolutely furious because she just caved and paid a $4.99 per month subscription for a recipe app,
Which serves as a brilliantly mundane catalyst for a massive philosophical argument.
Truly.
Her contrast is stark and honestly hilarious. She's holding her phone, looking at this recurring $5 charge, and comparing it to her grandmother who managed to feed a family of 8 people for decades using a simple physical box of index cards.
A physical box. The brick.
Yes. Rachel is outraged that she's paying a monthly fee just to be told how to roast a chicken or boil pasta. It feels absurd to her.
But Michael steps in to defend the model, using essentially the same logic you just used with the mansion analogy. He argues that Rachel isn't just paying for the raw text of the recipes, she's paying for the convenience of having them instantly accessible on her phone in the grocery store aisle.
The UI?
Exactly. The beautifully designed user interface, the intuitive search function, the automatic generation of shopping lists, and the continuous updates as new recipes are added. He focuses entirely on the utility and evolution of the service.
But Rachel isn't having it, and she immediately pivots to what I call the dark side of licensing. She points out that the convenience is actually a velvet trap.
A velvet trap. I like that.
The evidence she brings to the table is devastating. The terms and conditions clauses. She reminds Michael that hidden in the microscopic fine print of every single one of those convenient apps is a clause that allows the parent company to revoke your access, alter the product, or delete content on a whim.
And the sources cite specific historical instances of this happening.
Oh yeah, Microsoft pulling specific features from accounts that were on lower-tier payment plans, or Adobe completely killing off legacy apps that creative professionals had been using to run their businesses for years.
No warning, no refunds. The tool you relied on to make your livelihood is just wiped from your machine overnight.
That is the ultimate vulnerability of the tenant. You are at the mercy of the landlord's whims.
Exactly. And what is fascinating from a linguistic standpoint is how Rachel and Michael navigate this clash of values. Because they are friends, they have to argue fiercely about corporate ethics and personal agency without destroying their friendship. Let's look at the conversational tactics they use in action.
Okay, let's break it down.
Early in the debate, when Michael tries to sell her on the value of the experience in the interface, Rachel counters with a very specific phrase. That's exactly what they want you to think.
Ooh, that's such a sharp, evocative phrase.
It is incredibly sharp, but structurally, it is non-combative toward Michael himself. She isn't saying, Michael, you're stupid for believing this, or you're gullible.
She is challenging the foundational premise of his argument.
Right. She is identifying the corporate marketing narrative and telling Michael that he is merely repeating it. It separates the idea from the person, allowing her to attack the idea aggressively without attacking her friend's intellect.
It's almost like she's saying, look, we're both smart people, but you're currently being manipulated by a third party.
Right.
It creates an us versus them dynamic. It's you and me against the corporate marketing machine instead of me versus you.
Exactly. It's like pointing out a dragon behind him rather than swinging a sword at his chest.
Precisely. Now, when Rachel brings up the undeniable predatory examples of Adobe and Microsoft deleting things, Michael finds himself backed into a corner. He has to acknowledge that she's factually correct. Those things did happen.
But he uses a brilliant idiomatic defense to prevent her from winning the entire argument based on those extreme examples. He tells her she's throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I've always loved this idiom because it's so vivid and honestly a little bit morbid if you think about its literal origins.
Very much so. The phrase dates back to a time when plumbing didn't exist and entire households might share the same bathwater. The head of the household would bathe first, then the others, and by the time the youngest the baby was washed, the water was theoretically so dark and murky you could lose the child in it when you blindly tossed the tub's contents out the door.
Dark.
Very dark. But linguistically, what does it accomplish in this modern debate?
It acts as the ultimate defense against blanket condemnation. Michael is conceding that, yes, the bathwater is dirty. There are predatory companies, there are bad terms and conditions, there are greedy practices that delete software. The bathwater of the subscription economy is gross.
But he argues there is still a baby in there.
Yes. The baby is the convenience, the massive library of music, the instant updates, the fact that you can discover new artists from across the globe in seconds. He's telling Rachel, don't reject the entire modern digital economy just because of a few bad actors. Don't throw out the incredible good with the undeniable bad.
It's a phenomenal way to hold the line. It forces nuance back into an argument that was in danger of becoming completely black and white. And speaking of nuance, this leads to what might be the most disarming tactic in the entire C1 toolkit.
The concession.
Yes. After Rachel hits Michael with a particularly profound point, which we'll discuss in a moment, Michael pauses, takes a breath, and says, I hate that you have a point there.
I hate that you have a point there. It's such an incredible moment of vulnerability.
It really is. It showcases the disarming, relationship-saving power of a genuine concession. In a heated debate, we are culturally conditioned to never yield an inch of ground. We think conceding a point is equivalent to losing the war, showing weakness, and giving up.
But Michael realizes that acknowledging Rachel's valid argument actually makes him look more reasonable.
Right. It proves to Rachel that he is genuinely listening to her, not just waiting for his turn to speak so he can counterattack. It drastically lowers the temperature of the entire room.
It's like dropping your sword in the middle of a duel, wiping your brow, and saying, wow, nice swing. You can't keep aggressively fighting someone who just complimented your sword technique and admitted you landed a hit.
Exactly. So what was the swing? What was the profound point Rachel made that forced Michael to drop his defenses?
It's the most deeply philosophical part of the source material. It's about the attention economy. Rachel asks Michael a devastating question. Do you value any of it the same way?
This is the absolute crux of Rachel's argument. She posits that the less you own, the less attached you are, and ultimately the less you care.
Yes. Going back to our brick and mansion analogy, when you bought that one CD, that one brick for $20 in 1998, you chose it deliberately. You saved up your allowance or your paycheck for it. You took it home. You listened to it front to back 50 times, even the songs you didn't love at first.
You formed a bond with it.
A deep emotional, neurological bond with that piece of art. But now, because you live in the rented mansion, because you have frictionless access to 30 million songs and 10,000 television shows, you value none of it.
You just scroll.
Right. You open Netflix, you engage in 20 minutes of endless dead-eyed scrolling, you watch 15 minutes of a pilot episode while simultaneously looking at your phone, and then you turn off the TV and go to sleep. Nothing sticks. The infinite access has destroyed the intrinsic value of the art itself.
And this is where the conversation takes a sudden, sharp turn into dangerous territory. Michael, feeling the heavy weight of this existential argument about the hamster wheel of modern consumption, tries to dismiss it by artificially inflating it. He says, look, I don't think it's some coordinated conspiracy to keep us on a hamster wheel.
Oh, yes, the coordinated conspiracy. And here's where Rachel executes what the source considers the ultimate C1 conversational SWAT.
The SWAT. Yeah.
She refuses to take the bait. She doesn't get defensive. She calmly responds, it doesn't have to be a conspiracy to still be a problem. It just has to be profitable.
This brief exchange is a masterclass in identifying and neutralizing a logical fallacy. Specifically, what philosophers and logicians call a straw man argument.
Okay, for the listener who might hear that term thrown around online but isn't exactly sure how it functions in daily speech, can you break down exactly how a straw man works and why Michael's move was a textbook example?
Certainly. A straw man fallacy occurs when you take your opponent's actual nuance argument and you quietly replace it with a wildly exaggerated, extreme, or ridiculous version of that argument. You build a scarecrow, a man made of straw.
Why do people do that?
Because it's infinitely easier to knock over a scarecrow than it is to fight a real person. Rachel was arguing a subtle point about economics, psychology, and how infinite choice affects human attention spans. She never once used the word conspiracy. She never said shadowy figures in hooded cloaks were plotting in a smoke-filled boardroom to destroy human attention.
But Michael deliberately put those extreme words in her mouth to make her sound unhinged.
Exactly. By framing her thoughtful argument as a coordinated conspiracy, he tried to make her sound paranoid. If Rachel had taken the bait, she would have started defending her own sanity.
She would have yelled, I'm not crazy. I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
And the original profound point about the value of art and attention would be entirely lost in a shouting match about who is wearing a tinfoil hat.
The can of worms would be open everywhere, spilling all over the kitchen floor.
But Rachel's synthesis is perfect. Pointing out a straw man without losing your temper is a vital conversational skill. She calmly corrects the course of the debate. She essentially says, I am not defending the scarecrow you just built. I am not talking about conspiracies. Let's look at reality. It's just a highly profitable business model that happens to have negative side effects on our attention.
By stripping the emotion and the exaggeration out of it, she forces Michael to look at the cold, hard logic of her statement.
And that is exactly when he concedes with, "I hate that you have a point there."
So what does this all mean for us? We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We've walked through the morning break room, dodging the explosive grenades of infrastructure debates and media bias. We've sat in the living room, debating the existential dread of a $4.99 centipap and the death of ownership.
Two very different arenas.
Totally different. The environments are completely different, the stakes feel different, but the core lesson from the sources remains identical.
The tools you use to communicate are the load-bearing pillars of your relationships. When the pressure hits, the words you choose determine whether the building stands or collapses.
Words and phrases like, "let's agree to disagree," or gently calling out a can of worms, or softening a blow with, "I wouldn't quite go that far," or using verbal aikido with, "that's one way of looking at it." These aren't just polite filler.
No, they are essential.
These are the critical guardrails of modern society. They're the shock absorbers that allow us to travel over incredibly bumpy, polarized terrain without the wheels flying off the car. They allow us to disagree fiercely without destroying each other in the process.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, a thought that builds directly on the two major themes we extracted from the source material today. The concept of ownership from the app debate, and the concept of checking out from the political debate.
Connect those dots for us.
Think about the trajectory we're on. In the second case study, Rachel and Michael illuminated how we are slowly, almost willingly, accepting that we no longer own our music, our software, our games, or even our family recipes. We're getting comfortable being temporary tenants in our own digital lives.
Right.
Simultaneously, in the first case study, Tyler and Derek highlighted how the sheer exhaustion of navigating polarized, grenade-filled political conversations is causing people to simply check out of the civic process entirely to protect their peace.
It's too tense, it requires too much emotional labor, so they just walk away from the table.
So here is the question you have to ask yourself as you navigate the modern world. If we are surrendering the ownership of our tangible goods for the sake of convenience, and we are simultaneously disengaging from difficult conversations for the sake of our emotional comfort, are we slowly giving up our fundamental sense of agency? In the end, if you refuse to engage in the hard work of building and defending your own perspective, are you just renting your opinions from whatever news channel or social media feed is most convenient the exact same way you rent your software?
Whoa. Renting your opinions, that's a heavy thought. It goes right back to the beginning. Are you doing the hard work of diffusing the bomb, or are you just letting an algorithm hand you the blueprint of what to think? That's incredibly powerful. Well, we want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Our mission today was to give you the psychological and linguistic wire cutters to navigate those tense moments without blowing up your relationships.
The tools are in your hands now.
Take these phrases into your next uncomfortable conversation. See what happens when you soften the blow, when you sidestep the straw man, and when you actively choose to preserve the relationship over winning the point. Stay curious, keep leaning into the hard conversations, and we'll catch you next time. Goodbye. You know, usually when we talk about a physical reflex, there is this expectation of like biological inevitability.
Right, yeah, like it's just hardwired into us.
Exactly. Like imagine you are cooking, right? You reach out and you accidentally touch a hot stove.
Oh, the worst feeling.
It is. But think about what actually happens in your body. The nociceptors in your skin fire, and that signal shoots up your arm.
Up to your spinal cord, yeah.
Right, and your hand violently jerks back before your conscious brain even registers the sensation of heat.
Because it is an entirely autonomous closed-loop response.
Yeah.
I mean, the signal actually bypasses the brain initially.
Which makes total sense from a survival standpoint.
Oh, absolutely. Because if you had to wait for your prefrontal cortex to analyze the situation, you know, to think this surface appears to be radiating thermal energy, it would take way too long.
Right, you would suffer severe tissue damage.
Exactly. So your body just acts.
And we rely on that safety net. We want our biology to protect us from physical harm without us having to, you know, schedule a meeting about it.
Yeah, that would be highly inefficient.
But here is where it gets really interesting for our deep dive today. What happens when you take that exact same biological machinery and you step into the world of professional feedback?
Oh, it is a completely different ballgame.
It really is. You sit down for a performance review, or maybe a colleague pulls you aside to critique a project, and suddenly that deeply ingrained survival instinct becomes your absolute worst enemy.
We are essentially thrust into an emotional landscape that triggers the exact same defensive reflexes.
Right. But instead of saving us from a physical burn, it sabotages our careers, our professional growth, and our workplace relationships.
You're basically watching a prehistoric survival mechanism completely short-circuit in a modern office environment.
Because the stakes have changed from like physical survival to social survival.
Exactly.
Right?
But your nervous system, well, it hasn't received that memo yet.
Which is exactly why we are pulling apart this phenomenon today. Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. Our mission today is mastering an experience that is universally squirm-inducing for all of you out there.
Receiving criticism gracefully.
Yes, receiving criticism without letting your biology hijack your career. And the source material we are using to dissect this is actually really fascinating.
It's very unexpected.
It is, because it's not a corporate management book and it's not some academic psychology journal. We are looking at a transcript from a Learning English podcast.
Yeah, featuring two hosts, Emma and John.
Right, and they're just analyzing a specific workplace scenario. On the surface, it's ostensibly designed to teach English vocabulary to non-native speakers.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, when you analyze the specific phrases they are teaching, it completely transcends language acquisition.
Oh, for sure. Okay, let's unpack this. What are they actually teaching here?
Well, what they're laying out is this highly sophisticated sequential psychological toolkit. It is genuinely a masterclass in emotional regulation and conflict de-escalation.
And it just happens to be disguised as a lesson in business English.
Exactly. This isn't just about being polite. As the source notes right away, handling feedback without defensiveness is a literal superpower in the workplace.
A superpower! I love that framing, because it's so true.
It is. It demonstrates an immense amount of maturity and confidence. When you can just sit in a room, absorb a critique of your hard work, and not instantly throw up a verbal shield, you separate yourself from the vast majority of professionals.
Because most people completely lack that emotional control.
Right. But to understand how to build that superpower, we really have to look at the baseline reaction first.
The anatomy of the defensive reflex.
Exactly. The transcript highlights just how universal this challenge is. I mean, nobody wakes up hoping to be told their work is subpar.
Right. No one is like, please critique my spreadsheets today.
No, the discomfort is fundamentally human. And what the source points out is how this discomfort predictably manifests in our language.
It comes out in these involuntary verbal twitches, the knee-jerk responses.
Yeah, the transcript specifically flags that immediate but, or the classic, well, the reason I did it that way was.
Oh, man. I have said that exact phrase so many times.
We all have. Let's look at the underlying mechanics of that reaction. What the source describes as the emotional spike.
Why does that but jump out so quickly?
Because when someone delivers criticism, even if it's meant to be super constructive, your brain does not perceive it as a helpful tip for future optimization.
How does it perceive it?
It perceives it as an acute threat to your competence, your status, and your standing within the group.
Oh, wow. So it's an evolutionary thing.
Completely.
Right.
From an evolutionary psychology standpoint, being deemed incompetent by the tribe meant you were at risk of being cast out. And historically, ostracization meant death.
So your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, basically just sounds the alarm.
Exactly. It's a 5-alarm fire in your brain.
And you can feel it physically, right? Like your heart rate accelerates, your chest gets tight.
Your face flushes.
Yeah.
You are experiencing a literal flood of cortisol and adrenaline. Your fight or flight system is activating.
So when that but instantly jumps out of your mouth, it isn't just you being difficult or stubborn.
No, it's a verbal manifestation of your biological shield. It's your brain desperately trying to parry the incoming threat to your status.
But the fatal flaw here, as the source points out, is that this defensive posturing completely degrades your cognitive bandwidth, doesn't it?
Oh, entirely. While you are internally drafting your defense speech, your auditory processing essentially shuts down. You are no longer even listening to the feedback.
Okay, wait, I need to push back on this framework a bit for our listeners.
Go for it.
If we are genuinely comparing this to the hot stove reflex, if the amygdala hijack is this neurochemical flood that bypasses rational thought, how can anyone be expected to control it?
That's a very fair question.
Like, if my boss tells me my report is awful, and my brain interprets that as a literal threat to my survival, my verbal hand is going to pull back. Can we actually train ourselves to stop a reflex?
Well, we aren't pretending we have magic control over our neurochemistry. We do have to acknowledge the sequence of events here.
Right.
You cannot necessarily stop that internal chemical flood. You are probably always going to feel that initial visceral sting of criticism. Your heart will race.
So what's the solution then?
What this material teaches is that you can introduce a circuit breaker between the internal feeling and the external reaction. You can train the verbal reflex.
Okay, so you're not stopping the feeling, you're delaying the action.
Precisely. You are essentially hijacking the hijack. You force your prefrontal cortex, the logical planning part of your brain, back online before your mouth opens.
And that circuit breaker is the very first linguistic tool we pull from the source material.
The strategic pause and validation.
Right. The instruction here is to completely resist the urge to respond to the substance of the critique immediately.
You literally bite your tongue.
And you use a pre-rehearsed structural phrase. The source gives a couple of great variations, something like, okay, thank you for letting me know, or I appreciate you bringing this to my attention.
The structural nature of those phrases is what makes them so brilliant. They are doing an incredible amount of psychological heavy lifting.
Because they buy you time, right?
Yes. They are polite, they are non-confrontational, but their primary function is simply to buy your brain a few seconds to catch up.
So when you automatically deploy a script like, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, you aren't actually thinking about the feedback yet.
No, you are running a script. That script takes 2 or 3 seconds to say, and those are 2 or 3 seconds where you are not defending yourself.
You aren't escalating the conflict.
Exactly. And you are giving your nervous system a moment to metabolize that initial spike of adrenaline.
But let me play devil's advocate here, just putting myself in the shoes of someone receiving a harsh review. If I'm sitting down across from my manager and they just tore apart a project I spent 3 solid weeks on, and my immediate verbal response is a polite, thank you for letting me know, I feel like I'm just rolling over.
That is a huge fear for a lot of people.
Doesn't that make me look like a pushover? It feels like I am tacitly agreeing that I failed.
That is the exact fear that keeps people locked in those defensive patterns.
No.
But look closely at the syntax of the phrases the source recommends.
Okay, what am I looking for?
You are not saying, you are absolutely right, my work is terrible. You are acknowledging the transfer of information.
Oh, I see.
You are validating the act of them bringing it to you. You are not conceding the factual accuracy of their claim.
So you are acknowledging the delivery, but not validating the package.
That is a perfect way to put it. You are saying, I recognize that you are speaking to me.
Right.
And it is crucial to remember that delivering critical feedback is highly stressful for the manager as well. They are anticipating your defensive explosion.
They are totally braced for conflict.
Exactly. So when you respond with calm validation, you instantly de-escalate their stress. You signal that you are a rational actor.
You establish yourself as a safe harbor for feedback. I love that.
It changes the entire dynamic of the room.
Okay, so we've run the script, we've bought ourselves those 3 seconds, the cortisol is starting to level off, and we've thanked them for initiating the conversation.
Step 1 is complete.
But acknowledging feedback is only productive if the feedback contains actual usable data. What happens when the feedback you just validated is completely useless?
Because it's too broad.
Yeah. The source flags this as a major pitfall. The vague critique.
Oh, this is so incredibly common. They use the example of a manager just sliding a document back across the desk and saying, your report was a bit confusing.
A bit confusing. That is a completely useless grouping of words. What am I supposed to do with that?
It gives you absolutely no direction.
Right. Am I supposed to change the font, rewrite the thesis, add more pie charts?
If you simply deploy the first tool here, if you just nod and say, thank you for letting me know, you have effectively trapped yourself.
Because you accepted an impossible task.
Yes. You will go back to your desk, stare blankly at the document, and likely make a series of random panicked edits that don't address the manager's actual unarticulated problem.
Which brings us to tool number 2, moving from the vague to the concrete.
You have to force clarity.
The source dictates that you do this by asking targeted questions. The phrases they give are things like, could you give me a specific example of what you mean? Or which part in particular wasn't clear?
If we look at why managers give vague feedback in the first place, it's really revealing. Often it's because they haven't done the cognitive labor of isolating the exact problem themselves.
Right. They just read the report and felt a general sense of friction.
Exactly. They felt some dissatisfaction, and they just dump that vague feeling onto you. It's confusing. It's a subjective emotional reaction.
So by asking for a specific example, you are doing a couple of things. You are moving the conversation out of the realm of their subjective feelings.
And into the realm of objective data. You are forcing them to actually analyze their own critique.
It's like taking a car to a mechanic. Imagine you walk into the garage, you drop your keys on the counter, and you just look at the mechanic and say, "It sounds weird."
And then you just expect them to fix it.
Right. The mechanic can't do anything with weird. They have to force you to diagnose your own problem. They start asking, okay, is it a grinding noise or a high-pitched squeal?
Does it happen when you idle or only when you hit 60 miles an hour?
Exactly. You have to force the critic to be your mechanic. You cannot fix the engine until you make them identify the squeal.
That analogy holds up perfectly because it highlights the shift in dynamics. When someone says your report is confusing, it feels like an indictment of your intelligence.
It feels like an attack. It's adversarial.
But when you lean in and say, interesting, can you show me exactly where you lost the thread? It becomes a collaborative puzzle.
You are now both looking at the document together.
Right, trying to solve a structural issue. The adversarial tension just dissolves.
But getting the specific example still isn't the end of the line. Once you force the critic to give you the specific squeal, you have to prove to them that you actually heard it.
You have to prove you understand the diagnosis. You can't just say, got it, and walk out of the room.
Right. Which leads us to tool number 3 from the text, the mirror technique.
Also known as elevated active listening. The source suggests paraphrasing the critique back to the person in your own words.
The example they use is great. Something like, so if I'm hearing you correctly, the issue wasn't the data itself, but the way I presented it in the summary.
What's fascinating here is the deep psychology at play. Paraphrasing sounds so simple, almost like a corporate cliche, but it serves a vital dual purpose.
Unpack that for us. What's the first purpose?
First, it provides cognitive validation. You are utilizing tactical empathy. The primary goal of anyone speaking is to feel heard and understood.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone just wants to know they're being listened to.
Right. When a manager gives you a critique, there is a lingering anxiety on their end that you are just nodding along to appease them, or that you're going to go off and fix the wrong thing.
Because you weren't truly listening.
Exactly. So by repeating the core of their argument back to them, synthesized in your own vocabulary, you eliminate that anxiety entirely. You prove data transfer has occurred.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Think about how disarming that is in practice.
Oh, it's incredibly powerful.
If I come to you with a complaint, I am braced for your defense. I am expecting you to fight back.
Naturally.
If instead of fighting, you just calmly hold up a mirror and show me my own argument, the friction vanishes. It completely removes the tension from the room.
It takes all the kinetic energy out of the conflict. It's very grounding.
And it also serves as a safety net for you, the employee, right?
I think so.
Well, it gives the other person a chance to correct any misunderstandings. It proves you aren't just dismissing them. And if you got it wrong, they can say, no, that's not what I meant.
Yes. It ensures total alignment before any action is taken.
Okay. To see exactly how this friction is removed in real time, we need to look at the specific high-stakes case study provided in the source material.
The anatomy of a tough review.
Yes. Let's dissect the dialogue between Sarah, the manager, and Ben, the employee. Ben just wrapped up his Q3 client presentation.
And the text makes it explicitly clear that Ben poured his absolute soul into this project.
Oh, totally. He talks about putting in a ton of work, the late nights. He wanted to ensure they had all their bases covered.
He really over-indexed on preparation.
Yeah.
And Sarah, his manager, acknowledges this effort right out of the gate.
She opens the conversation by praising the sheer volume of his research. She calls the depth of the data incredible.
What's fascinating here is Sarah's masterful use of the sandwich method.
Right, the classic management technique. Positive, negative, positive.
Exactly. She starts with the positive, incredible data depth to soften the incoming blow.
But Ben doesn't let the praise distract him, because the actual meat of Sarah's feedback is a devastatingly common corporate critique.
She tells him that during the presentation, he got a little too lost in the weeds.
Lost in the weeds. Oh, that phrase. It hurts precisely because it weaponizes your own hard work against you.
It implies that your diligence was actually a liability.
Right. Let's explore why Sarah makes that critique. She explains that the executives just didn't have the time or context for every single data point.
By presenting the entirety of his research, Sarah points out that the key takeaway got buried.
Ben fundamentally misunderstood the assignment. He showed all his homework instead of just giving the answer.
He thought his job was to prove how hard he worked. Sarah is gracefully correcting him, saying, in that room, your job is to deliver the synthesized strategy.
I really want to focus on Ben's own realization from the text because he synthesizes this brilliantly with an architectural metaphor.
It's a skyscraper analogy. It's so good.
It is. He says, I got so focused on showing the foundation that I forgot to just point to the top of the building.
It's a profound realization about audience awareness.
Think about a massive architectural project, like a new skyscraper. The foundation is undeniably the most critical part of the structure.
It requires the most math, the most concrete, the most grueling labor.
Exactly. If the foundation fails, the whole thing collapses. So the architect, naturally, is incredibly proud of that foundation.
But when the investors and the executives show up for the ribbon-cutting ceremony,
they do not want to be dragged down into the sub-basement with a flashlight to look at the load-bearing rebar.
No, they absolutely do not care about the concrete density.
They're there to take the elevator to the penthouse and look at the skyline. The foundation is assumed. They trust that you poured the concrete correctly. That is literally why they hired you.
Ben spent his entire 10-minute presentation dragging the executives into the basement, shining a light on every single brick he laid to prove his worth.
Right. He exhausted them with the foundation and completely buried the penthouse view, which is the actual strategy they needed.
It's a classic symptom of imposter syndrome, really. Over-explaining to validate your own presence in the room.
Sarah diagnosed the problem perfectly, but the real magic of this interaction lies entirely in how Ben chose to react.
Deconstructing the perfect response.
Because internally, Ben has every reason to let that amygdala hijack take over. He put in the late nights.
The biological reflex is screaming at him to say, but you told me to be thorough. If I hadn't done that research, we wouldn't even have a strategy.
If he says that, the meeting devolves into an argument about effort versus execution. But Ben intercepts the reflex. It's the ultimate application of the toolkit.
He executes it flawlessly. First, he paraphrases. He says, so if I'm hearing you correctly.
And then he acknowledges the validity of her point. He says, that's a fair point.
Notice the dignity in that response. He isn't groveling. He isn't self-flagellating. He maintains his professional footing.
And then he executes the final critical pivot. He asks for specifics. Could you give me an example of what you would have cut?
That specific question completely de-escalated the room. Sarah's specific answer, cutting the entire section on 5-year historical market trends down to a single sentence, turned an abstract criticism into a practical lesson.
Right. She gave him a repeatable rule for the next time. Focus only on projected growth and strategy.
So what does this all mean for the dynamic in the room?
Well, this specific sequence of phrases transformed everything. It went from a boss scolding an employee into 2 colleagues working together to improve a process.
He flattened the hierarchy.
Exactly. He completely neutralized the threat. But, as we know, fixing the problem is only part of the equation.
Right. You still have to physically end the meeting and walk out the door.
How do you walk out of the room without making awkward promises you can't keep?
Which brings us to tool number 4, the professional close.
The final tool is closing the conversation cleanly. The source suggests phrases like, that's really helpful feedback. I'll definitely take that on board.
Or, thank you. I'll keep that in mind for the next project.
In the case study, Ben wraps it up perfectly. He tells Sarah, I appreciate you being direct with me. That's genuinely helpful feedback.
The source makes a really important note here. You do not need to promise to change the world overnight.
You don't have to vow to completely overhaul your personality.
Right. A clean, positive end is crucial for maintaining the ongoing professional relationship. This raises an important question, though, about how to maintain boundaries while accepting feedback.
Okay, let me push back on this then. What if, at the end of the conversation, you still think the feedback is somewhat wrong?
It happens all the time.
Like you used the pause, you mirrored the feedback, you got the specific example, but you realize your manager is just factually wrong. Do you just smile and say, thanks, I'll change everything?
That is exactly why phrases like, I'll keep that in mind, are beautifully diplomatic.
It's a non-committal shield.
It is. It's not about being weak or agreeing with everything. Saying, I will take that on board, literally just translates to, I have received your data packet.
Taking it on board just means putting it on the ship. It doesn't mean you have to let it steer the vessel.
Exactly. As the source says, it's about being smart enough to extract value from an uncomfortable conversation without compromising your integrity. You safely exit the conflict zone.
That is the true superpower. Let's do a rapid-fire recap of this toolkit for everyone listening, just to ensure you have your mental checklist ready for your next performance review.
Okay, step 1, acknowledge. The strategic pause. Thank you for bringing this to my attention.
Step 2, clarify. Move from vague to concrete. Can you give me a specific example?
Step 3, paraphrase, the mirror technique. So if I'm hearing you correctly.
And step 4, close, the professional exit. I'll take that on board.
If you internalize that sequence, you effectively immunize yourself against the toxicity of poorly delivered criticism.
You absolutely do. But before we sign off, I want to leave you all with a final, slightly provocative thought to ponder.
Oh, this is the twist.
Yeah. The source material is strictly focused on professional environments, corporate presentations, office jargon, HR guidelines. It's all highly structured.
Very optimized for the corporate sphere.
But what happens if you try deploying this exact, carefully crafted professional toolkit in the middle of a heated argument with a romantic partner or a best friend?
That is a wildly volatile variable to introduce into a personal relationship.
Right. Imagine you are having a huge fight with your partner. The stakes are deeply personal. They lob an emotionally charged criticism at you.
And instead of reacting normally, you channel your inner corporate diplomat.
You look them dead in the eye and say, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Could you give me a specific example of what you mean?
The tonal whiplash alone would be staggering.
Would this level of clinical emotional management save the relationship by forcing active listening? Or would the sudden corporate politeness just infuriate them even more?
Oh, I think it would practically detonate the relationship right there in the living room.
Right. They would look at you and scream, stop managing me like I'm one of your direct reports.
Human emotion deeply resents being managed by an algorithm. The context of intimacy requires a completely different frequency of empathy.
The mechanics are flawless, but the application is everything. We highly recommend you master the sequence for the boardroom, but apply these tools very, very wisely in your own personal lives.
Keep it out of the living room, folks.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Hopefully the next time you feel the heat of that stove, you will know exactly how to keep your hands steady. We will catch you on the next one.